sort of storytelling tips and tactics. So on our monthly call earlier last week, which feels like a decade ago now, we took a look at the maps, the enacted maps, and started talking about the need to be able to, talk about them and spread the word about them and build our narrative about why these maps are bad, why we need better maps. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today in a little bit more detail, sharing some tactics that you can use and that we're planning to use. And we would love to collaborate with volunteers and people in North Carolina on, how to really communicate with a broader audience about what's going on with these maps and why they matter and why we need relief. So to just briefly introduce all on the line in case folks, I see some new faces, which is awesome. Thank you so much for being here. We are a 501c4 campaign, and we exist to bring folks together to win on redistricting in 2021. And we're going to have to update that because it's going to be 2022 pretty soon. That's the year we're going to win. And so our goal is really to increase grassroots engagement on the redistricting process, and to, inform people and give folks opportunities to defend our democratic ideals, and just raise awareness about how gerrymandering is harmful for our policy and our democracy. I want to invite folks who are here with us live to introduce yourselves in the chat if you're comfortable. You can put your name, where you're joining from. We'd love to know, where folks are joining and calling in from, and your pronouns. And then do want to reiterate that this meeting is being recorded. We will share the recording out with everyone who registered. And it will probably also be on our YouTube channel so folks can come back and look at it later. We may do additional trainings like this as well, as we like to say that we're building the plane as we're flying it. So as we get feedback and if people have things that would be helpful, we'll do additional trainings. And just a reminder, if you're here live, to remember to stay on mute if you're not speaking, but also feel free to come off mute and ask questions. This is a pretty informal training. We want folks to be able to ask questions and give input, and we'd love to have some engagement for folks if they're, in a place where they can do that. I know it's lunchtime on a Tuesday. And we'd love to also hear in the chat if anyone, someone's walking a dog by my house. I don't know how to handle that for Zoom. Like, maybe take over while the dog passes.
Okay. So, okay, it looks like I think you covered most of the stuff under introductions. If you want to go to the next slide, or did you miss?
I just want to say, we would love to hear from folks. If you're here live, what are you hoping to get from this training? If you had an idea about what you're expecting coming in, that's helpful for us to know, to try to accommodate that in this space and also to plan for future training. So we'd love to hear that in the chat if folks have thoughts.
All right, so this is our agenda for today. We went through the introductions. We'll talk a little bit about why we're here, why we're doing this training, why we think it's important, sort of what role it's going to be playing in the work that we have coming up. We will talk a little bit about sort of storytelling tools and tactics. Then we will go through the actual maps. So a lot of the foundation of what, we're hoping the storytelling will be about how the maps are affecting you. So we'll talk through how you can find that out. I think we'll go into a bit of a fuller LTE training at that point, LTE 101, because we think about that as sort of the basis of storytelling. If you can write an LTE, you can do any of the other tactics that we're going to talk about. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So why we're here is because we really want to try to build an authentic narrative about why we need fair maps in North Carolina. Some of you may have seen that there is already narrative being put out there by the people who drew these maps. about how what the judges are doing is sneaky and secretive and unfair, and they're being activist judges and they're unaccountable. When the truth of the matter is that we know from public polling that the people of this state want our courts to throw out unconstitutional maps. They want the courts to take action to make sure that North Carolinians have fair maps. But there's a really strong narrative that's already being developed in the press, and I'm sure you all have seen the articles or seen it on Twitter, that this is something that is sneaky and underhanded that the judicial system is doing, when most people in North Carolina don't actually believe that. We need to make sure that that is not the only narrative out there. And one way we can do that is by making sure there are lots of counteracting narratives from people who are actually affected by the maps, right? So all of these, operatives and political consultants who, people, who work for these kinds of groups are out there saying these things about how the maps are great and how these cases are wrong, when that's not what ordinary people believe. We need to have a narrative that goes against that comes from the people who are actually being affected by these maps. And so that's why we're here today, is to help you kind of generate a narrative that we can use to fight back against the messaging and show what people in North Carolina actually want to see from this process. So, we want to use those narratives to raise community awareness about, how important this is, and show and, talk about what the problems are with these maps. We want to drive coverage and make sure, especially, we would love for on a state level for there to be a really strong narrative about how people want this, but also, local outlets are also super important. And that's also why it's important for people like you to work on and come up with these narratives, because your narrative is going to be the most compelling for people where you live, because they live in the same community, they live next door, they live in the community on the road. It's going to feel relevant to them. And so we need to sort of drive that sort of both state level and more local coverage of how these maps are affecting people negatively and what the people of the state actually want to happen. And again, also, this is another way where we can kind of hold legislators accountable for what they're doing, is by having these narratives out there and using them to put pressure on. Because, as we know, legislature is not going to stop being involved in these maps, even if there is litigation. So, yeah.
And before we move on, I just want to lift up something that someone put in the chat, which I think is an important point, because we hear it all the time. Constance said, the response we often get is that Democrats would do the same thing. And that's the exact kind of narrative that I think that this kind of storytelling, and the tactics that we're talking about can be used to push back against. And, I guess I would say to that, there's a couple of responses. One is that if you look at states where Democrats are in charge, they are moving much more rapidly towards independent commissions than states where Republicans are in charge. And also, I know I hear a lot, that Democrats did it before Republicans did it. And, the response that I have to that is that, like, okay, but we need to do better moving forward, that we can't, do something bad just because people did it before us. I don't know if you have anything else, any other additional thoughts on that, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, I think if people are saying that Democrats would do the same thing, I think that is irrelevant, because people deserve fair maps. First of all, the politicians should not be involved, right? That is the real response. The real response is that we need independent redistricting. Politicians should not be involved in the first place. It doesn't matter what politicians would or would not do. If they do something that is unfair, it is still wrong. And so, I think we need to sort of flip that narrative and say, it doesn't matter what Democrats would do or Republicans would do in this situation. Any legislator who's drawing maps for their own advantage from whatever party is wrong. And if those maps are litigated on, the court should ensure that there are fair maps in place. It doesn't, I think that is a total non sequitur. It should not even be a question. I think that we all agree that politicians shouldn't be drawing maps in the first place. So don't get drawn into that narrative by them. I mean, that's the answer. Yeah, even if that's the case, I don't care. They shouldn't be drawing maps either.
Awesome. Yeah. And I appreciate Constance putting that into the chat. And I want to invite folks to lift up as we're talking through this. If you have things like that that come to mind of like narratives that you've heard that you're not sure how to respond to, let's lift them into the chat so we can have conversation about that, because this is exactly what we're talking about is, you know, having answers and also putting forward our narrative that we don't want politicians drawing the maps, right? Like that's the whole point. They shouldn't be drawing maps that that they are going to be elected under.
Yeah, and I
so,
think
yeah.
also keeping the conversation to where we are, which is the fact is that the Republican majority in our state legislature has drawn maps that are egregious partisan gerrymanders. That's the fact. I don't care what Democrats would have done because they didn't draw these maps. We are right now in a situation where Republicans have drawn egregious gerrymanders. They are in front of us. They are real. They are affecting us. Let's not be talking about some hypothetical thing that hasn't happened yet. Let's be talking what's happening here and now, and that case that's in the courts.
100%. Okay. So yeah, keep those kinds of questions coming, y'all. We are gonna move on now to talking a little bit about some various tactics for, you know, getting this narrative out. And then I'll also say at the end, I think, like I said this in the agenda part, but at the end of this session, we would love to hear, you know, so be thinking about this as we're talking, you know, what else is helpful? What can we do to provide content or messaging? You know, I'm taking notes as we're in the chat, and it's helpful for us to know what's helpful to you. So that's what I'm trying to say here. So some of the, and also I just want to mention it again, like reiterate that we're going to talk through these tactics, and then we're going to look at the maps, and then we're going to dig deeper into sort of like how would we actually, we'll do a sort of case study and look at how are we going to message about a particular map, and hopefully that will be helpful. So let's see. Leica, do you want to talk through this one?
Yeah, so this is sort of a range of the kinds of things that you can do once you have sort of put together the skeleton of your story. Like I said, we're going to be working a little bit more intensely on a case study of writing a letter to the editor, or often you'll hear this referred to as an LTE. You know, these are letters to the editor that get written to papers, statewide papers, local papers, and get published. And this really is something that tends to, you know, first of all, your local legislators read these letters to the editor to get a sense of what their constituents are thinking. Other people in your community will read them. It's a good way to kind of raise consciousness, especially when it's something that's relevant to your local area. And so we're going to be talking about how you make it relevant to your local area, but it's sort of a really baseline tactic. It's something that people do all the time. It's something that we know is effective. And it's also sort of, if you can write a letter to the editor, you can do any of the other things that we are going to talk about. Next thing would be sort of social media content. So if you can write a letter to the editor, you can make a tweet thread on Twitter, you can make a Facebook post, you can post on Instagram with pretty similar content, and that's just another medium that you can use. You know, it's a little bit different. You might want to be even briefer than you would be in a letter to the editor. You might want to include some graphics and pictures, but it's also another way to kind of get your message across, raise consciousness. Shareable graphics are also something we're going to talk about. Graphics are something that, you know, you would probably mostly use on social media, but, you know, we are going to give you some tools to hopefully make some graphics that are based on your story that you've put together and that you can use in a lot of different social media settings. And then the last thing is videos. So, you know, videos are also another thing that you can use in a lot of different contexts, and they can be really compelling and effective. We have some tips for how to make them, you know, the best possible. The other thing that I think I really want to say is that part of what we're doing here is not only are we trying to kind of teach you these tactics and help you put these materials together, but part of what we're trying to do here is help you sort of develop and collect the elements of your story so that we can also come and help you turn them into something effective. So for you, you know, you on your own will tell you how to write a letter to the editor. But we also, I don't know if you want to share it now, Brie, or later, but we also have a form where we're kind of asking people to give us the bare bones outline of their story. And that's something that we are going to use, throughout the next few months to also come to you and help you, create particular kinds of content that fit stuff that we want to raise up on on our channels, or something like that. So for instance, we often have reporters and journalists come to us and say, do you have a volunteer from this area who's affected by this map? Can I talk to them? Can I get their story? That happens a lot. If we, have your story, if you filled out the form and we know it, we can say to that reporter, yes, we know someone in that area. They have a really great story. Let's connect you with them, and you'll be prepared to give them like a really good, helpful interview that can really raise consciousness about the subject. Similarly, for social media stuff or graphics or videos, if you fill out that form and we collect your story, we may come to you and say like, hey, we've decided that, during the week of the case, we're going to do a series of social media posts with people's stories who are affected by the maps. Can we talk to you and take a video with you? Can we, if we know something in particular affects your neighborhood, can we come to your town and take a video of how your neighborhood is split up? Can we make a graphic of you with with a quote from you? So not only is this a tool for you to create content, but for us to collect and know that you have a particular story, know what area you live in, how the maps affected you, then we can also sort of come to you when we are trying to create particular campaigns about particular issues and raising consciousness in some ways. So it's both stuff that you can do on your own, and also you're kind of creating a resource bank for us so that we can come to you and help have people with real authentic stories that we can incorporate into social media campaigns to raise consciousness about these issues. Does that sound right, Bree? Did I leave anything out?
Yep, that's absolutely right. That's what we're going for. We've been having, I see folks on the call that I've had conversations with recently about, what the maps are doing to their area. I had an interesting conversation with someone in Gastonia over the weekend, and we looked at the maps together, and, she was telling me that how, the area that's split is the downtown, like actual neighborhoods are split, and it doesn't make sense the way that they've done it. It breaks apart the community. And that's the kind of information that, we can sort of see by looking at the map, but it's really so much more compelling to hear someone say, this is my town, this is a neighborhood, like I know people who live here, and it makes no sense that the line is drawn here, when this other part would make more sense to be in this district. And that's really the kind of information that's super useful and that you all will use in your own messaging, and that we would love to be able to collect and understand as well. So yeah, we'll just quickly kind of go over some tips for writing LTEs, and we're going to do that for each of the tactics that we're going to talk about today. And then, like I said, we'll look at the maps, and then we'll dig a little deeper into what it might look like to write a letter to the editor about your particular situation. So, for folks who haven't written a letter to the editor before, they're usually about 250 words in North Carolina. And the main thing is that you've got to keep it short, right? Like, I know when I write, I tend to sort of be kind of rambling and expansive at first, and that's okay, but then you want to figure out what you're going to write, and then you got to get it really concise and make your points, because letters to the editor, that they're only going to run about 250 words, so you want to get your points made quickly and concisely. It is good if you can tell your story, if you can be yourself, and your letter is authentic to you. It's not a form letter. But any kind of personal anecdotes or personal information that you can share that's related to the point you're trying to make is helpful, because it's going to help you connect with the reader. You want to avoid wonky policy details. This is especially challenging sometimes when we're talking about something like redistricting maps, because they're sort of wonky. So, one of the things that we hope that this training will kind of help you think through is, how do you talk about the maps in a way that's accessible and And that's what storytelling is about. It's what's happening here, how does it affect me, without getting into, this is not about getting into like, well, this precinct is this many Republicans and this many Democrats and like that kind of thing. This is about communities and the impacts of these maps. You do, use powerful language, make your points clearly and concisely. If you can, if it makes sense, you can include a call to action. A lot of times when we write letters to the editor, we're asking, our representatives to vote a certain way or make a certain decision. You might be asking your, fellow community, the reader, to do something or take an action. Or maybe in these cases, you might just want to explicitly state what you want to see happen. So like, I think an example here is with letters that we might write around what's happening now is, we're glad that the courts are taking this up, and we appreciate that they're, moving quickly, and they're going to look at these cases and these maps before the election. There's a lot of messaging out there that was not the right thing to do from the other side, and we want to make sure that the messaging out there is like, no, we're happy about this. This is a good thing. This is the way our system is supposed to work. Definitely want to check for proper grammar, make sure that you don't have spelling errors, have someone take a read, and just make sure that, everything is in order. You've crossed your T's and dotted your I's and that sort of thing. And finally, it's really easy to find now where to send a letter to the editor. You send them by email. We have a tool that we may put up a letter to the editor campaign at some point in the next few weeks, but we also want folks to know how to do this on their own, and make sure that you can get letters to the publications that you want to run them. And so figure out, make a list of the places, your local publications that you want to submit your letters to, and you can just Google the publication name and letter to the editor, and it'll usually, give you the right link for where to send it, or else the web page for your publication should have that information clearly there. Okay, we're going to talk next a little bit about graphics. This is, we've put together some template graphics, and we'll share a link that you can use. Graphics are a great way to, I don't know, Leica, should we go ahead and share? Do you want to share the Canva link? So Canva is a tool that is free. You can create an account, and then you can they have templates already in there. We've created some templates based on graphics that we've made in the past. And you can use those templates or create your own. But it's a great way, especially when we're talking about maps, having a picture of the map that you're talking about is really effective. Pictures are worth 1,000 words all the time, in my opinion. Yes, I did used to be a photographer for my job, but I do believe that people appreciate visuals. And so if you can include a picture, if you're going to do a social media post, and you can make a quick little graphic and include the picture of the map and then what you want to say about it, that's going to be a lot more kind of salient for folks. And they're also more likely to look at it if you're posting to social media. A great tip when you're doing any kind of graphic design, and I am not a graphic designer, but is just keep it simple. Err on the side of simplicity. If just because you can do something doesn't mean you should when it comes to graphic design. So keep it simple, and if you want to include a lot of words or context, think about, can I create a simple graphic that's clean and clear, and then add the context that you want in the post that you would, or an email or a Facebook or Twitter post, that kind of thing. So those are just a few quick best practices. And Leica is going to add some info.
Yeah, no, the only thing I wanted to say is that, so just to talk through a little bit what the templates are, is there are a few different templates where you can put a quote from yourself about the maps. And we have we've got a couple of examples of people from the Sandhills region whose quotes we've shared in the past. And so you can see the kinds of things that they said. That's sort of probably the kind of thing that you might want to put in there. There's a space for you to put a picture of yourself. We have a couple of different colorways that you can choose which one you like. Also at the bottom, there are these really simple images with pictures of the maps that say, my name is blank, I live in blank county, and this map doesn't represent me. If you would like to do a post like that and you live in a county other than the ones that I've got samples of, you can just put that in the chat. I'll really quickly make a graphic of your county. Those maps that are in there currently are of the state house, the enacted state house maps. And so that's probably what I'll choose. But if you want one from the state Senate or one from the congressional, just say so. But if you want one for your county, just let me know in the chat and I'll make one.
And also, I'll also just say, you know, we're here for you, where our job is to support you all to do this. And if you're a person who is like, I don't want to learn a new tool, I get itchy when I have to like do graphic design, anything like that. If you're going to post something or you have an idea about, you know, what you want to communicate, you can email us. I'll put my email in the chat and we will tell us what you want and we can probably get it together for you pretty quickly. We wanted to give you all the tools to be able to do it yourselves, but also we're here for you in whatever way we can support. The last thing I want to just briefly mention is videos. Like Leica mentioned earlier, you know, we are hoping to identify some folks and some places where we can go and make some simple, compelling videos to show, you know, some of the crazy ways that these maps are dividing neighborhoods and communities. I mean, I could walk a block from my house and show you where like two sides of the same neighborhood are in two different districts. And that's the kind of thing that videos are great for. And actually, you could also do this with a graphic. If you live somewhere that's got a, you know, a compelling visual of, you know, guess what, this side of the street's in one district and this side of the street's in another district, you could go take a picture and pop that into the graphic and say what you're going, what you know, give the information about it in the writing. Videos are another great way to do that. And we'd like to find folks who are, you know, interested in collaborating on videos. Also, the particular kinds of videos that I'm talking about right now in terms of what I think folks can do pretty easily themselves is, and I know I see people on this call who have done them, a selfie video. Like you could go and stand somewhere outside or even do it, you know, in your house and just write a little script or write a, you know, what you want to say so you don't, you know, ramble like I tend to do. But if you write yourself a script and you make a short video of yourself just saying, you know, why you care about this and what are the problems in the maps where you live, you know, those kinds of videos get a surprising amount of traction on social media. It's a great way to tell your story. And, you know, you can do it as many times as you need to till you feel like you've got a video that's that you're happy with. A few just tips to think about if you're going to record a video. Definitely keep it short, you know, especially if it's like a selfie video, you know, 30 seconds is great. Definitely keep it under 2 minutes. Be aware of your background. Like when you set up your shot, probably best to be standing still and just try to make sure you have a clean background so that there's not something distracting right behind you. Also be aware of ambient noise. You know, I think in this particular situation where we're talking about maps and communities, if you can think of a place where you could go and stand to shoot the video, that there's something behind you that illustrates sort of the story, that's great. But just be aware of how much ambient noise there is, because if you don't have special equipment like a microphone, you're going to want to find somewhere that's relatively quiet or go at a part of the day when there's not like a lot of traffic or construction, because that kind of noise will be really distracting in the background of a video.
I know this from experience, have definitely tried to take a lot of videos in front of busy roads. It does not really work.
Everything that you hear in, our brains kind of compensate for ambient noise in a way that videos don't, and it can really be, it's too distracting. So you got to find somewhere that's pretty quiet, that doesn't have a lot of ambient noise, or do the video, just in your house in a nice quiet spot. Again, write out what you want to say, plan it out a little bit. You don't have to go overboard, but just plan out what you want to say, and then, introduce yourself, tell your story, just talk. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know, everything. You can just say what you think. And it's a great way to get information out there. And again, I just want to reiterate, like, the point of all this is that, there are 24 people on this call right now. We've trained hundreds of North Carolinians over the course of this year, but there are like 10 million people in North Carolina. Most people are not paying very close attention to this. And now is the time for folks to pay attention, to do do a little research, get interested. And these tactics, this kind of storytelling stuff, is how your friends, your family, your neighbors are going to be most likely to say, oh, let me Google that, or, figure out what I should know about this because my neighbor posted. That's incredibly effective to get people interested in paying attention, and just give them accurate information. Like I said, we see intentional kind of misinformation coming from, some people in North Carolina, some politicians who want people to, believe certain things. Having grassroots folks talking about their own communities is a really important way to show that, like, this isn't something untoward. This is, people just want fair maps, and you can illustrate that. So anyway, anything else to add, Lika, before we kind of jump into maps?
I don't think so.
Okay. So we thought that we would take a little case study, look at one place in North Carolina. I wasn't sure, who was going to be on the call, but we thought it would be helpful, based on some feedback from our meeting last week, to just look at the maps and think about, what is the messaging, what is the conversation, what would you want to lift up, and then hopefully you can take this and apply it to the maps where you live. And we should have some time at the end if folks want to look at other areas. I'm going to hop over actually to, we will drop the link. Do you want to drop the link to the Carolina Forward page so that folks can find these for themselves if they want to? This is the state house map in Forsyth County. So I just want to, ask folks to take a look at this. And, this is what we hope that everyone will do in their own communities. But I want to show you how you can use this tool, and then ask folks to put in the chat or unmute yourself and just say what you think. Like, what do you notice about this map? When you use this plus and minus, you can zoom in and out, and over here on the left-hand side, you can click uncheck city lines. So those blue lines are municipalities. You can turn them off if it's not helpful, or you can turn them on. I think for our purposes, it's helpful to see where the city lines are, because especially in the house maps, the North Carolina house, not the US house, one of the things that we see a lot is that they're splitting cities, they're splitting small towns and cities. And so that's like one thing that you could certainly just lift up. Okay, so Angie put in the chat, this amber bar that goes into the purple region. That's what I noticed too, first of all. We are, if we zoom in here, you can actually see, and then, so what is it about that? First of all, it looks weird. So you immediately think, well, there's something funky going on there. When you zoom in, you can see on these maps, because you've got this, it's hard to see probably on the screen, but if you're in there looking at it yourself where you live, we've got an overlay. The background map is checked, so you can see there's like streets and landmarks that are visible. I can turn that off, but again, it's helpful for me to see kind of what's happening in the city underneath this map. So when you zoom in, sure looks like Wake Forest University is in this little arm here. So Wake Forest University and this part of the city, which if you know Winston-Salem at all, like that's right in the city, is pulled in. These little precincts here are pulled into a district that includes, you know, this much more rural part of Forsyth County, and then all of Stokes County. So if I live there, and I have friends who live in Winston-Salem, so you know, I would feel like, you know, if I live in one of these precincts that's right in the heart of Winston-Salem, and I'm, you know, going to be voting with folks in all of Stokes County, you know, I think my interests probably are a little bit different. If I'm a student at Winston-Salem University, you know, I'm living in an urban area. I care about, you know, maybe I care about the environment. I care about student loans, whatever. I, you know, might think that my interests are not going to be heard by my representative if it's, you know, a very rural, combined with a very rural area.
So in the chat, Angie said that the argument back would be the precincts aren't split and those two precincts were needed to make the numbers for the Amber region. So let me just say, within the state legislative districts, there is a huge allowable population variance. It's plus or minus 5%, so 10% total. So that's a very large population allowance. So there's no way that that district needed those exact two precincts to make up population. Very easily, that population could have come from precincts that are on the border with Stokes County, you know, or is that Surrey or Stokes? I'm sorry.
That's Stokes, yep.
That's Stokes, yeah. You know, that population could have come from anywhere else. There was no actual need to go down into the city. Because once, you know, we have this complicated thing called county groupings, but once you're within those county groupings, the lines can be drawn in whatever way make up population. And because of that huge population variance that's allowed, there's actually quite a bit of latitude in how those districts are drawn. And so going down and getting those two particular precincts that take up Wake Forest University, there are, you know, experts run maps and can make tens of thousands of versions of maps, right? It's quite possible to make tens of thousands of different versions of maps that follow all of the available criteria within each of these clusters, and come up with a map that does not look like that. So if you hear that excuse from anyone, it's not relevant. It's you know, the very fact that there are tens of thousands of options for these maps goes to show that there's no way that they needed to go down and capture Wake Forest University in particular. There were probably a lot of other options, again, especially given the fact that there is a huge allowable population variance.
And the other thing to look at is, you know, you can find a lot of information using this tool about the different precincts, and, you know, just thinking about what would make more sense. In this case, you know, like I said, like there's no reason that we can tell that these particular precincts would need to be included with Stokes County, especially, you know, why is this metro urban university grouped in with a rural county where that's not even, you know, people don't, probably most of the people who attend Winston-Salem, don't even go to Stokes County for anything. And then you have other precincts up here that would probably make a lot more sense. I mean, yes, you have to draw the line somewhere, but the other thing I notice about this is if you look at the municipal boundaries of Winston-Salem, it's split into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different house districts. Would it not be possible to have made that 4 house districts, and instead of including these pink districts down here, these pink precincts down here, change the makeup of it, and you would have had to split Winston-Salem proper fewer times. Again, this all is sort of, there's no right or wrong answer, but it is information that you can use, questions to ask, I think.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I would emphasize, it is not your job to draw a fair map. It's your job to provide the input and say what's not fair, what's not working for your community, what would be probably better for your community. So people who, live around and go to Wake Forest University can say, this doesn't make sense for me. This doesn't work for my community. It would make more sense for me to be in a district with the rest of the central city instead of paired with Stokes County. It is the job of whoever's drawing the map to figure out how to make that work and make it fair. It's not your job to go in there and draw a perfect map. That's not what's required of you as a citizen. Your job is to give that input, give that information, and the people who are drawing the maps, hopefully experts, are going to try to make that actually work in a way that makes sense. And again, like I said, the fact that experts can create simulations that draw tens of thousands of options goes to show that there are a lot of different ways that this could be done. And so, what's supposed to come from you is the information about your community, what would be best for your community, what's not working for your community. It's not your job to draw a perfect map. So if someone says, well, this is because of this population reason, you can say, this doesn't make sense for my community. And a real expert could make this work because I know that there are a lot of other ways to do this.
Awesome. Yes. While we're on the subject of Forsyth County, let's just look quickly at the state Senate map. We want to encourage y'all to look at each of the 3 maps. So there are 3 maps that will impact your specific community. So there's the North Carolina House, the North Carolina Senate, and the US House. So just take a little bit of time and try to think through each one. The North Carolina House in this area is sort of the most clearly, egregious because of that arm. Although, people in local areas, I think I saw someone on the call who, lives here, and we noticed that her neighborhood is split. There are, some of these areas are going to split places that are, really cohesive. If you live in a neighborhood, I think it was Ardmore. Ardmore is split into 2 or maybe it was 3 different house districts in this map. That's the kind of thing that, yeah, the lines have to be drawn somewhere, but they don't have to split up a neighborhood. So that's the kind of information to lift up. And then when we think about the messaging, again, this is another situation where, if it's your neighborhood that's being split, we might be talking about, a letter to the editor, but we also might be talking about an email to your neighborhood listserv to be like, hey, okay, thank you, Karen. I knew we had that conversation. Ardmore is split into 3 house districts. So maybe it's just, an email to the Ardmore listserv to say, hey, are y'all paying attention to this? There's a trial going on, and here's a link to the maps, and, here's, why I'm concerned about this. Because if that neighborhood ever needs to deal with the state about something, they want to have 1 rep, probably. Most folks find it easier to talk with 1 politician than 3. So those are the kinds of things to think about and be able to lift up and be able to communicate about in whatever way makes the most sense for you. like, I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about this, or do folks want to, does anyone see anything that they want to, in this map of Forsyth? So this is a county grouping. Again, Forsyth and Stokes County are the same county grouping, so they had to be combined. But there are potentially different ways to draw these districts here. And I don't know if, like, if you have any thoughts that you'd want to say about kind of, this is something we see a lot, this kind of like C-shaped districts in the Senate map in particular. But what do folks think? Does anyone have any immediate thoughts? I don't know if there's anybody from this area here. Or like, if you have any particular.
I think that what I would say in general is that what we have seen is sort of artificial packing of urban communities in particular. And so, you know, this is sort of, again, another one of those situations where we really need input from people who live in the area. But, you know, the way that these districts are often drawn is not a way that necessarily follows particular community lines or takes into account information other than, as far as we can tell, partisanship. So, you know, when we see, I think, you know, in a lot of these litigation, what they've been saying is that a lot of these kind of state legislative districts are packing as many Democratic voters into as few districts as possible, sort of without regard for what actual communities look like. So, for instance, I'm not necessarily, if I live somewhere, I'm not necessarily in closest community with the other most Democratic precincts in the area. I might be, but I also might not be. That, you know, that's not what determines what a community looks like. A community is determined by a lot of other factors. And so basically, by trying to really efficiently pack people, these maps tend to ignore what people actually need, where people actually live. It's not talking about where I go to grocery shop or where people in my neighborhood work. It's just looking at, it seems to just be looking at partisan outcomes, right? And that's what's not right about it.
And I apologize, I had initially this is Guilford County over here. I was like, somebody feels in Guilford, and for still I was confusing myself. This is Forsyth County. And so to answer the question in the chat, this is I mean, packing is when you answered the question, like in your explanation, but packing is when they're trying to get as many of one kind of voter into a district as possible so that they have less impact in other areas. And
yeah. So basically, you know, if you were maybe drawing these maps along the lines of what people from the area had said they wanted, where they said they lived, you may end up with districts that are much more competitive because, again, people's lives don't follow these strictly partisan lines. People live where they live. They have the communities they have. They think about where they go to work, where they commute to, where do they shop, where do they go for entertainment. Those are the kinds of things that actually, you know, matter to people when they think about being well represented and not just being sort of packed in this way. And so, you know, if you weren't packing voters, you may end up with both districts being slightly more competitive, per se, because if you're following actual lines, again, where people live doesn't perfectly line up with what provides partisan advantage for a particular party. And so that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about packing, is that, you know, politicians looking just at partisan outcomes and drawing the districts just on that basis, not on the basis of where anyone actually lives or what makes sense for them.
Right. I mean, this is assuming that to me, when I look at this map, and again, you know, this is, just my opinion, but when I look at this map, it just looks to me like, they're not taking into consideration, how people in this area actually live.
Yeah, actually, Bree, I think maybe like a good example of this is also in Wake County. I think the Wake County Senate map.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you look at that map, then you can kind of see like there are just some strange shapes happening. So, there's this yellow district, District 18, that has this sort of like finger that's coming up, and it's creating sort of some extra splits in there that aren't really necessary. That's not like it. That's not doesn't seem to be necessarily based on who actually lives there. And we actually know that, there are, for instance, a lot of Black communities in that part of the county. So we feel like, if you kind of looking at this from a geographic level, that yellow finger might not really make sense, but it may be serving some kind of partisan purpose. Anyway, just to say, like, if you're seeing districts that look a little bit strange shaped, or you don't understand the reasoning for them, it seems like that's something to think about, that there may be sort of partisan interests at play instead of something that would actually make sense for the different communities, right? So when I think about that area of Wake County, I think about sort of Wake Forest being pretty integrated with the rest of northern Wake, and I think the way that's shaped doesn't really follow that.
Right, exactly. And if you live here or someone who lives here, they can probably look at this and say whether, well, this kind of does make sense, or no, that doesn't make sense. Like, this is part of Wake Forest, effectively part of Wake Forest. What we heard the politicians who drew these maps saying a lot was, we kept the municipalities intact. And while that's true in certain maps, they also, aren't necessarily taking into consideration that the areas where people, are right outside of it, but really are functionally part of the city. And that's the kind of thing that local knowledge can really lift up. And I just also want to point out that when you are looking at these maps, you can get more information about the precincts that might tell you a little bit about, what was going on, or what, what you think could be happening, or why they might have made certain choices. That might just be interesting. So when you scroll over a precinct, you get on the right-hand column there demographic information about who lives in these areas, which I just think is an interesting thing to be able to look at as well. And when you're thinking about why were certain precincts included in a given district, and why are those lines splitting the way they are. Okay, and then we'll just briefly look at the congressional map. One of the big things that we see in the congressional maps, one of the big problems that we see is these large urban counties. So it's Mecklenburg, Guilford, and Wake are split into 3 different congressional districts. And when you're looking at the maps and you're, putting out information and kind of messaging, I think one of the things that's effective is to, especially if you live in one of those places, is to zoom in and look at, these lines and where they're drawn, and like, how do they impact how people actually live, right? And then if you were paying attention to the hearings, like, for example, in Guilford, we heard a ton of people say, who were in Jamestown and High Point, that they wanted to be kept with Greensboro. That obviously didn't happen, and the county split into 3. So zooming in and looking and just pointing out for folks locally that, if you're in this neighborhood, you're split into 2 congressional districts. Does that make sense? And while it's true that the line has to be drawn somewhere, there's a lot more dividing lines in the congressional map of these 3 counties than there needs to be. So like I said, putting out the information for people to like do their own research and draw their own conclusions is our job, is to make sure that people are able to look at this, understand what's happening, and then just raising awareness is a big part of why it's important to be doing this. We're getting close to time, actually, so I want to move back over to quickly just kind of go over, when you're thinking about writing an LTE or any kind of creating any kind of messaging or content, These are the questions that we would encourage you to consider looking at each of those 3 different maps. Number 1 applies to all the maps. How is your specific community or neighborhood handled in the map? Are you going to, be able to have a voice in electing the representative that for the district that you're in? And do the lines that are as they're drawn make sense and serve the community? Like I said, you don't have to have like the right answer of what should be done instead. Although if you have ideas about like what would make more sense, that's great. But all you have to do is say, if something doesn't make sense, lift that up. In particular, in the North Carolina House map, look for small cities or towns that are divided unnecessarily. In the Senate map, look at those C-shaped districts and think about if there are alternatives that would make more sense. Is there a reason that they're drawn that way, or is there a different configuration that makes more sense to you? And then in the congressional maps, in particular, look at those divided metro areas that are then grouped with far off areas that have different interests, and how does this affect the local neighborhoods? How are they split? How's that going to work during elections? Is that going to confuse people? And also, how will they be represented? If you live in Guilford County and you're connected with rural counties on the Tennessee border, are your interests going to be met by the person that you're able to elect? So
yeah. One thing I do want to say, especially when you're thinking about the house maps and you're thinking about smaller cities that are divided. So the rough size of a North Carolina House district is around 80,000 people. If your city or town is smaller than 80,000 people, you can ask, why is it not being kept whole, or at least mostly whole in a house map when it's the right size to be kept whole? If it's being split, especially if it's being split multiple times, like we've seen a lot of places be split up to 3 times, and that's happening even though it's the right size to be kept whole. That's a good thing to kind of look into and ask that question.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to kind of quickly go through these LTE kind of tips and best practices, and then we'll have some time for questions if folks want to stay on. But I want to try to make sure that we get you what you came for, which I hope was also everything we've gone over so far. But again, just quickly, a letter to the editor is a 250 words or less usually, and typically includes a call to action for elected officials or community members, or even just, a call to action could be, take a look at this and see what you think, because you need to make your voice heard, or you need to, be aware of what's happening. We already talked about, why you want to write a letter to the editor, and this is true also for any other emails, newsletters, or social media posts that you might make. They are going to be read by people. They demonstrate, it's important to not be silent, to put your thoughts out there, to counter some of the, intentional misinformation that we're getting, especially around this issue of the maps and the court cases. And it does help to persuade people who might be on the fence or might not have heard that much about it, or are just going to, see the headline here and there. And then just as we're thinking about, messaging on this, and we're going to continue developing this and share with you all, and we'd love your feedback. But thinking about ideas for writing a letter to the editor for your local paper, think about just talking about how one or more of the enacted maps impacts your own community. Share what you want to see instead. If you have ideas about, what you'd want to see, I know a lot of people who are on this call went to the public hearings, asked for Guilford County to be kept whole, write an LTE, make social media posts, be really specific and use images and pictures to inform other people about what's going on and how it's going to harm them. We also can ask in the letters to the editor and in other messaging, this is about supporting our democracy. This is about getting fair representation. This is not a partisan exercise. This is about, we need to have representation and we need to have people who are going to listen to our needs. And it's also an opportunity to call out politicians or folks who might be spreading misinformation. And thank you. I see people have to jump off. I know it's lunch hour, so I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm happy to stay on for a little while, and I would love to hear feedback, questions, ideas, anything like that. I think Leica is jumping on a call, a previously scheduled call at 1 as well. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I will send the recording of this as well as some resources that we dropped in the chat and some additional ones as well. We are, like I said, trying to create tools, and the recording should be posted later today. And so if there's anything that folks would like to see that would be helpful, I will put my email in the chat. And you're welcome to email me anytime. If folks have questions or comments or ideas, just unmute or put them in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, this is Marlene. I'm going to stay off video because I'm not exactly dressed.
Okay.
This is my first time, and I've been reading up and learning about this just out of curiosity as a business person. And I've been following it from the federal level. And I mentioned the 2 books that I got a hold of. David Pepper's letter of Laboratories of Autocracy. He's been all over the place, scaring and alarming people. And this is my first time, but I saw in the news where the judges or the decision makers on how the map should be, they don't care. They just go ahead and do it despite people's protests. So what I've been thinking is like, gee, how did this happen? Look how far they've gotten. Is just thinking not only short term, but long term strategically. Because I realized this all started with the census, didn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And, a lot of people didn't know the significance of the census. So I'm just thinking long term, how we could prepare young people today and just give them the story, starting with the census and how it impacts the maps and what you're doing here, and how it's a 10-year deal. So all the decisions that are being made right now, they've been in the works 10 years ago or more, but how can they plan now strategically over the long term for themselves and the things they need to pay attention to? So I just wanted to throw that out because I'm shocked that this is how the system works, and I didn't know it at 53 years old.
I know, right? I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. I mean, I'm 40 and I do this for my job, and I'm constantly learning new things about, how the system works. And I think, yeah, I saw someone else had put in the chat, the need for like more in-depth civics classes. And I think that's a great idea, Marlene. Thank you so much for lifting that up.
Well, where would we get a civics course that gives you a crash course on all of this and connects the dots quickly before they make a decision? Where would you go for that?
I mean, the problem I have found doing this work, or one challenge I find doing this work, is that it is hard to do it quickly. It's hard to tell the story quickly. It's hard to get people, because it's a complex issue, and like the reasons we do certain things, you can't necessarily, at least I haven't figured out how to do it.
Can I share with you? For me, I've been like alarmed nonstop for the last 5 years. And I got to the point where I started to question where people in the House and the Senate, how did they get their jobs? How much do they get paid? How do they get there? And that's where it started for me to research who these people are. Why is it that they keep coming back to Congress? And I actually watched hearings to see what their character and disposition were, who were the true public servants and who were there for their donors. So I literally broke it down to the personalities, and I'm like, oh my God. But the thing is, if you don't know to ask those questions, then they'll just keep coming back and only doing what's within their interest. So I think just taking interest in the people and the personalities and breaking out, I literally broke out like all 100 seats in Congress, who these people are and where they're associated with. Do we have a shot with them or no? Who owns them? Who are the true public servants? When you break it down that way and see why we're not making any progress, I think that's powerful, because then it will click for people. It's like a soap opera.
I mean, that, and well, that's exactly, you're talking about because what you're doing there is really storytelling. I mean, that's what's interesting to people. You're absolutely right. I appreciate that. And I would love to see your research.
It's mind blowing. But I'll just say this, that it's people are into sports and they're into entertainment. For me, just dissecting how this government works and how it impacts our lives, it turned into a sport for me. Just like you analyze athletes and their statistics and so on, it's been the same game for me with these politicians. So thank you for being there. I'm excited to learn more, but that's been my journey for the last couple of years. Mind blown every day. Thank
you so much for sharing that. I totally agree with you. And I think that is so interesting. And that is what we're here talking about to do, is how do you make this interesting for people?
Appealing. And I mean, I'd be happy to talk to you some more, because this is not my area, but I'm just intrigued, and I'm like, oh my God, how can we help the next generation and prepare them? Because as I said, I'm 53 now and I didn't know all this stuff. And now I'm like inhaling it every day. I work for myself, so I have the time to do it. But I just feel like people need to know this. Young people need to know this, because they'll lose their power.
Absolutely.
Hi, this is Angie Lunking. Can I just jump in there in a second to address that, Marlena? Because that has been my concern. What I actually do is I tutor young people. I'm an SAT, ACT test prep tutor. But the issue has always been like, how do I've toyed with the idea of trying to create a civics course for young ones on YouTube or do something like that, a podcast, but it's very hard to reach them and it's a complicated thing. And so what I'm unclear about is, when I was in school as a youngster, my teachers, my history teachers would engage us and talk us about current events, political events, have us do like mock elections, things like that, really to engage us. And I don't see a lot of, I actually think they do that, but they do it in a very distant kind of like, oh, this isn't really real. And it's very divorced from the reality of every day. I don't understand why every high school isn't having their after school like club, or even doing something right now to say, hey, look, we're living gerrymandering real time, because all of us were taught about it in school, Boss Tweed and gerrymander where the word was, but it was like a remote history lesson. And I guarantee you that most people didn't remember that, because I'm talking to my fellow, classmates from college saying, hey, look, gerrymandering is going on. And some of them are going to me like, Ange, can you tell me again just what gerrymandering is? It's that like lost. But honestly, I've had students come up to me and I bless them. They started, like Young Democrats Club or Young whatever club, or, Young Political Action Club. And they're like, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. All we hear is kind of like the superficial on the top. And this kind of stuff of really knowing, how you need to, kind of be a little bit engaged civically, what you can do, how you learn about it quickly, and then mobilize quickly is very important, but isn't being taught to them anywhere. And that's my curious. I think it's very politically, like teachers don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, because it's so, hair trigger polarized at this point. And it's just too risky for them. But that's such a loss, because we're watching our democracy just kind of, dissolve because everyone's too frightened to do or say something if it may impact their job. So, you would think it would happen in the field of education, but I also understand completely why it isn't, because
That it's not going to. It's not
Right.
going to. The other thing is I didn't grow up in this country. So I had to, I mean, I went to college here, but I didn't grow up here. So I had to learn, I had to express curiosity in 2015 to figure out what the heck is going on. And I just got sucked in, and it's been a wonderful journey. So the reason why I'm here is to try to figure out how I could share it with young people in general. They might not be able to do something now, or they may wonder why things are happening in the world about them, but at least they'll know.
Yeah, so I think this is why Bree and Leica are so awesome, because, giving us ideas for the graphics, for letters to the editor. But if you really want to reach young people, you're going to have to go on and do like a TikTok video, a couple of Instagrams, maybe a short YouTube, and make it appeal to them somehow. So I always talk about trying to get my students to do these for me. I'm always like, come on, do a TikTok for me. You guys know what reaches better than I do. Please. We made a Get Out the Vote video in 2019, or I think, no, actually 2020, right before the elections, to try and get out there. And I think Jennifer Roberts ended up like putting it up there. But once we made it, we couldn't get it out. There's still the issue of how you get the word out. Like, how do you get it distributed other than just asking all your friends and family to like post it up there? We were hoping it would go viral. We were hoping Lin-Manuel Miranda would take it and kind of like, oh, look what they did, because it was a parody of, Your Shot. I'm not going to give up, lose my shot, and do that. But we got maybe a couple of thousand views, nothing near like what we wanted to. But in the end, all the kids that participated in making that video were now like, they took some action, and a lot of the kids said, maybe I'm going to do something more now that I understand this, and it was fun. So I think they're willing to get engaged. It's just really hard to figure out how to pull them in and get them engaged. So definitely, if you have like nieces and nephews, just start with your family and friends, anybody, and like get together like little parties, like poly action parties, the civic parties, and just go out and tell them, come on, let's do this together. Let's look at these maps together, and I'll make your favorite, dip while we're at it. Or get your friends together and have, okay, this is going to be a gerrymandering cocktail hour, and we're all going to look at the maps, and we're all going to post something or whatever. But I just, even when I would ask people to vote, I would say, go out and vote and get 3 of your best friends to go with you. Let's just multiply it. And it's really key to multiply the effort, right?
Even on the question on going out to vote, my question is, vote for what, and vote for who and why? I'm all about asking questions. So
yeah, and that's great. But at the end of the day, what we're really fighting is huge amount of apathy, because that's what the kids are scared of. They're like, I don't know enough to vote. And at some point, you're like, you're not going to know everything you need to know. You have to make an assessment. You have to research within the time you have, but then you have to take action and just do the best you can and pivot when you need to, because they're so time starved, and their attention is in such demand from so many sources that a lot of times they just want to hide. They just want to stick their head in the sand because it's overwhelming. So it's less about like, you and I, we live in a generation where we had more stability and we believe in reason and rationale. But these poor kids, they're watching a tsunami of issues. They are panicked. So what they really just need is something simple, clear, some reassurance that their vote does matter, and it's worth it to take action, because it gives them a sense of agency. And that's kind of what they need. So that's what I'm sharing with you. And I'll stop now and jump off. But really, thank you very much, Bree and Leica.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you for the last thing I'll say is, I don't have any kids. And for me, it came from a place of fear with what I saw happening, to the point where I'm prepared to leave the country and go back to where I came from, because I'm just terrified of what I see happening. So I'm coming from a different perspective. So for me, it's just more informing and alarming people, letting them know, hey, this is how this works. Here's what's going on. Whether you're 80 years old or you're 8 years old, like, this thing people need to know. So thank you guys for being here and for listening to me rant.
Thank you all for participating, and I love this conversation. I wish we could stay here all afternoon. Maybe we'll have to do more spaces like this for just sharing ideas and this kind of back and forth, because I think it's super interesting, and I think we all feel that way. I mean, I identify with what you said, Marlene. With I think in this country we're generally not afraid of the right things, but were you going to say something, like
No, I just also want to say I'm so thankful for how engaged people are and how many good ideas that they have. And yeah, maybe we should do some more sort of just like workshopping spaces where people can bring some ideas and we can get started on them and at least sort of help that move along.
Yep. So we will, unless anybody else has questions or thoughts that they want to share out, I'll put my email in the chat again. We'll send the follow-up email, and we are going to continue working on resources. And I saw some things in the chat that folks were hoping to see, like example LTEs and things like that. So it's been a little bit of a wild week for All on the Line North Carolina, but we will try to get some of that stuff together, and just, we'll send our regular emails. We'll keep you all posted when we have follow-up, or we'll try to do some more trainings to help with this, and maybe we can do some stuff where we actually create some content together. But please reach out if you have ideas or feedback, or you'd like to work on something with us. We're very open.
Bree, I just want to mention that I put in the chat that the League of Women Voters in Mecklenburg County actually do a Civics 101 class. It looks like they suspended it temporarily because of COVID, but they are taking people's names on their waiting list. So they probably do it in other counties too, I would imagine.
Great flag. Thank you so much, Mary Jane. Yeah, that's an amazing resource that we should all be taking advantage of. So, okay, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Please let us know how we can support. And if you have ideas that you want to share, my email's in the chat, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.